Greetings once again, my friends. This is Noah Fredericks here. And this tape I think you're going to find very exciting. At least I did. I'm speaking of the evidence and the research that I put into this, where I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're going to clear up a lot of things that we talk about diluvian days, pre-diluvian, and the days of the Great Flood. And so many times you'll hear the preachers and the teachers and the historians, if they ever do touch on these things, they seem to run, or should we say ram them all together, and leaving total confusion in the mind of the listener. But that's understandable, because most of the time these people who are teaching on this subject, they are confused. And let me reiterate that, as we said, now, I do not deny that there was a great flood that took place in the Upper Tarim Basin in the mountains of China, when there was a segment of our white race, of the Aryan peoples who migrated out of India, or at that time known as Indra. After these people, these I believe were the Semitic, Adamic people, not just being a male and female. And keep in mind that we pointed out, like in the Farrar Fenton Bible, where it speaks of the great cities of Adam and the great cities of Eve, and we told you before the great allegory that the peoples of old and China and Babylon and records out of Macedonia and Egypt and throughout the world, that our progenitors spoke of planets as rocks, they spoke of them as trees in the allegories of containing family trees, and they spoke of them as cities and flying cities. Many times, too, this could be confused as we've gone back into the records and the sages of India there, and we've read from their records about some of these motherships, the great aircrafts, as I believe, and I really didn't plagiarize it from him, but George Adamski, it was many years, 25 years or so later, that I really actually sat down and started to read through his books, where he spoke of motherships and the smaller type ships going in and out of them. But many times, as we quoted to you from the ancient records of India, that these cities, flying cities as they were called, they were shot down. Now, I believe that these records are pertaining to an ancient age, and speaking of other worlds, because surely there would be evidence found here on this earth, but then too, from such an ancient age, it's quite hard for us to understand that where there can be, like you go over to Jerusalem today and you go to the sites of Babylon and so forth, and they find as they dig down in the strata, they come across former great cities that were even greater, and civilizations that had been covered over by many, many layers or feet of dirt and dervish and so forth. And this is hard to believe that this can take place within a 5,000 or 6,000 year period. But I wanted to cite to you the fact that I pointed out in one of our last tapes that I had learned years ago, and from the ancient writings it was hinted at it, but this professor that I was to sit under, who was one of the most knowledgeable men that I had ever met in my entire life, and probably one of the greatest orators, his name was Dr. Swift. And I remember he spoke of the ancient people of India, and he was one of the men that excited me and created a great interest in within the very being of my soul, and he caused me to research and look into the deeper things and into records and science and archaeology that I never in my wildest imagination had I dreamed that ever existed, nor did my preachers nor teachers ever allude to the things that he brought out to stimulate my young mind at that particular period. But as we pointed out, it was from him that I had learned that he said that the word Indra was actually an ancient term used by the Aryan. Now, if this sounds racist, then you got to go in your library and you got to throw away your just plain old Webster's dictionary, because he tells you that the most ancient of people who settled in India and left their records behind, they were called the Aryans. Now, I often thought that could have meant the heirs of Yah. And we find in those ancient days it was called Indra, and after looking through some of my very old notes that I had kept for years, I ran across that this professor or this doctor had said that Indra actually was an ancient term for the Heavenly Father, like Yahweh is used in the ancient Hebraic. But then we find later on that a lot of these satanic people and evil people who moved into the area long after the multitudes of the Aryans had left the area, and some of them were absorbed by the local primitive people, and so a lot of this great knowledge and history got lost. And then later on it was a goddess, Indra, and which they had distorted down from, as we pointed out, that we talked about Lucifer being a planet, meaning a bright, shiny star. And we, I think, proved conclusively where paradise was, and we proved also that it means the very same thing as the Garden of or of Eden. So here it represented not only a physical house, a great space platform, as we pointed out, just using a regular old concordance of 100 years old, and alluding to the household, or where a great abundance of the eternal Yahweh's family lived. And so it got distorted to where it no longer represented the Creator, but then it started to represent the created. And so instead of worshiping the Creator, they worshiped the physical creation. So it's so very sad, but while we're on that subject, I think that a very interesting book that I have a first edition of it. It was entitled The Encircled Serpent by M. Oldfield Howey. Now, he did quite a fascinating study and research into the symbols of the serpent from all of the different countries and back through the different ages and what they were to mean. And so, unfortunately, not only to us older and the middle-aged and the younger people, all of this, whenever you say serpent, everybody immediately conjures up this picture in their mind of this talking serpent in the garden from Greek mythology that's been incorporated into today's pseudo-Christianity. You know, the dude that told dirty stories to Eve and got her in a sling. But anyway, I think that we have pointed out in quite a number of our other audio books, and I think we proved conclusively, that in the ancient days of antiquity, going back into the records of the Americas from the Mayas, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and the ancient Babylonian Egyptians, and all these other great historians, and especially the Chinese, they referred to the great ships of space, not only the ships that contained the adversary, but also that the sons of the Most High flew around in. They referred to them as the serpents. They referred to them as dragons, and if you use your concordance, do a cross-reference, you'll find that one equals the other, that they're synonymous. And I think that we've quite well explained that, so we needn't go into further detail, but something that we might start to question. We talk now about the pre-diluvian days. And as I told you, I probably didn't tell you this, let's take the Farrar Fenton Bible. There's one thing that causes a little consternation with me, and I find it kind of interesting and exciting. As you look into the Farrar Fenton Bible, you'll notice when this mysterious Noah built his ark. Well, your King James Version tells you he put a small window in the ark for light and for ventilation. But if you look in the Farrar Fenton Bible, he said he put a ventilator fan in. Now, my dear friends, we're talking about an archaic, primitive people. How did they run a ventilator fan? Are you going to tell me they used a squirrel cage and they had rodents going around the clock, running on the track to run what would have to have been a pretty gigantic fan in order to ventilate the gases that were to build up inside of that thing? Regardless if it was just a few animals, or as they would have us believe, that they saved 3 million. Without even going to the Strong's Concordance, as you search through these old records here, you run across bits and pieces that don't seem to fit together. I have a set of 4 books, which, by the way, if any of you would like a set of those, they're 4 of them is called the Interlinear Bible. And it covers both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's written out on the page in the Hebrew with the English below it. And then off to the side. And you remember that the language in ancient Hebrew was written from the right to the left. And I think where a big part of our problem came in was when the English translators in that far-off, distant, archaic, dark ages, when the power of the Catholic Church denied them access or the mention of science or mathematics or higher learning. They were kept from this. They said that everything that you need to know was contained within God's holy word. Well, by the time these men had got done distorting God's holy word, we're mystified. Now, I noticed in reading this Interlinear Bible, as I go back and read it from the right to the left in the Hebrew, and it talks about, and then Noah's ship was lifted up above the earth. Then we go to the King James Version, and it tells us, then the waters lifted it up. Now, is this what it was? What was really meant, or was this what the translators assumed that it meant? Now, as I say, I believe that there's the evidence beyond the shadow of a doubt that I cannot refute, that there was great chaos and calamities and natural phenomena of great upheavals that took place in the Upper Tarim Basin and the Han Mountains of China, and we know in the dynasties of which pharaohs that we've quoted to you, and there seems to be some controversy about that, but one way or the other you can align it, you can take your choice. I've quoted from the different authorities and the ancient records and what the Chinese say about it, and they recognize that there was a man that they referred to as a Noah. But, as I said before, this is only one very small segment of a great overall war that took in many other planets within our galaxies. And here we had a bunch of, shall we say, condemned prisoners who had been sentenced to death, befitting of their crime. That they were fugitives, if you want to accept, like the book of Enoch, these men who landed on Mount Hermon. And they came down here and they taught women to paint their faces. They taught men to make war. And so they decided to hire a hideout in these areas of China. They were outlaws. And here the Almighty, did he possibly send his extraterrestrial angels to equate it to something today that young people can understand? Did he send out bounty hunters and just use natural phenomenon to create this? I mean, we've heard today and we understand that science can salt the clouds. And as we've read throughout our Bible, I think that we've proved quite conclusively, given enough enough evidence that not only through the biblical records of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, where we spoke of Paul and the Irokadon machine, the one that created the great winds and great clouds, and we're told by Scripture not to worship clouds. Well, my goodness, There's nobody that ignorant or primitive that's going to sit down and start worshiping something passing over his head that's constantly changing shapes. It's referring to those who came in the clouds in these great extraterrestrial ships. But we would have you to know and understand that there's a lot of things that went on in ancient antiquity here and something that we're missing. So he sent these bounty hunters, and we've learned that our progenitors, and we talked about the divine winds. You remember that audio tape? And how then we go back to Elijah, and he spoke of clouds. And so don't you think that those ancient people could not only create clouds, but they could salt the clouds, shall we say, as we do today, to cause that rain to come down for such a very long time? And don't you think that they could create such a disturbance in the upper atmosphere, and using possibly some sort of gravitational pull or destruction, or by reversing it, they could cause these earthquakes at the exact precise time, just like the messengers who went and warned Lot of the impending danger that was to ensue. And I believe they gave him an exact time, and they gave him time to go out and search for 50 righteous men. Then he kept narrowing it down, 40, 30, 20, 10. All right, you better get your wife and the kids and get out of town because the time's growing short. So had they already set some sort of a time bomb, shall we say, to ticking, something that was irreversible? Well, we find once again, let me remind you, in the New Testament, Christ twice, he warns them. He said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man, as it was in the days of Lot. Now we go back, and allow me to, I've wandered around the old mulberry bush, but I'm going to take you back now to this ancient, what they call the Naga myth in nature, where they talk about, this was written by an ancient Indian poet of the, what they call the Rig Veda. I will sing the wondrous story, thunder-armed Indra's glory, how he won from Vertra's might captives' water sprinkling bright. Selt for them the mountain way, roll the rivers rich and gay. Now this sounds like that this could be applicable to the upper Tarim Basin. And we go on, it says, Indra pierced the dragon clouds. Now remember what we said about the dragon ships. The ancient Chinese poet that we quoted to you, we're going to quote some others before this is over, where he called these great black ships of the great dragon, they called them the yin and the yang ships. Indra pierced the dragon cloud, darkened mountains in a shroud. Tiwashtri forged the lightning dart, fashioned with celestial art. As the milch can to the fold, rivers to the oceans rolled, like a bull impetuous strong. Now, my friends, remember what we said about Thor, what we said about the wounded bull, and we showed that in the ancient days of antiquity, the planet so-called that we call the mighty and great space station that was referred to by all of the ancient primitive people at one time or another, they called it the Great Bull. And I believe here in this ancient saga or poem of this ancient Aryan writer that he was telling about the day when Venus or the Great Bull began to leave its orbit and move across the heavens, and he created great climatic change in the tide and in the weather and the clouds, and creating such a magnetic pole and probably rocking the earth on its foundation. Because remember this, I think I've cited this to you before, that the earth prior to the time of the flood, it was rotating around the sun in perfection. Then after the flood, our historians, ancient astronomers, and so forth, they say that the earth even wobbled at a 45-degree angle, and ever since that period it started to straighten up on its axis. Well, so keep that in mind. Like a bull impetuous strong. Indra, now remember, is speaking of a great god of space. Was this Yahweh, the god of the Semitic people, of the ancient Aryan people, and spelled just differently, like the doctor said? Like a bull impetuous strong, Indra hymned an ancient song, drank the soma 3 times given, grasped the forked brand of heaven, smote the firstborn fiend of might, rolling upon the mountain's height. Now, who was the firstborn fiend? Anybody who's any biblical scholar whatsoever who has ever picked up his Bible or ever touched on the book of Genesis, who was the first killer? Who was the firstborn that everybody assumed was the firstborn of so-called Adam and Eve? We know that this was Cain, who was not a wimpy punk who destroyed a whole great nation and civilization that was referred to as none other than Abel, righteous Abel. I believe he was a whole world, he was a whole nation. I believe he's one of these allegorical, is used in an idiom that was spoke of by Job when the servant or the messenger, in other words, an angel, an extraterrestrial, came to this great patriarch they refer to as Job, and they said, you had one of your sons, which was a great planet, and I think we're going to prove it in a little bit here by going to the Greek and hearing their side of it. They're saying the very same thing. But you go back and read this book of Job, it talks about when the Lord sent fire out of heaven. And my friends, now if you're just one of these lukewarm Christians here that says, praise the Lord, that's the only thing coming out of your mouth. Well, my friends, the Bible said there's Lord's many and God's many. And so I say that this was not always referring to the Almighty Yahweh. And so this was those, whether he's an enemy of you and I or he's the Almighty Yahweh's adversary, you got to take your hat off to the old boy if you could really grasp and know and research your history and find out what a great ruler, this great Cain, as he's translated from the word Khan. And as I've pointed out before, in India, that they had the great Khans of India. And then we go to the Chinese. We have the and from the Hebrew, there was Sargon the Magnificent, Sargon the Great, who came down through the lineage and the very line of this great conquering Khan, this destroyer of worlds. Worlds, my friends. Don't underestimate him as just one man. And he who proceeded into China and had those people and apparently gave some evidence to make them believe that he was a great god warlord of the heavens. And he brought those of his entourage that surrounded him who were lesser great war gods. And they were to breed in with the people of China. A lot of those who preceded them in our last tape, I hope that you understand that where it talks about, the great and mighty trees of Lebanon, that one of the great parables that Christendom has failed to understand, that talk about in the remote days of antiquity, this great Oriental empire that took rule over the whole known world. Many of them had preceded the Semitic man. Many of them were colonies living here on the earth, while this great wars and conflict between the planets was going on in outer space, as we cited to you the 12th chapter Revelation that talked about there was a great war in the heavens. Now, we go back and refer once again to this poem of great antiquity. It says, darkling Vitra hid the world. Listen to this. lightning lances Indra hurled. Now, we're talking about probably great laser weapons, a smaller version of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Is this what they broke up the connecting walls of this mountain range to cause great tidal waves to come in from the ocean and to destroy this area in the upper Tarim Basin in the Han Chan Mountains? And it goes on, it says, in his thunder deadly stroke. My friends, there's nothing deadly about thunder. But now he's talking about the noise and the sound and the explosions that were created by these lightning lances Indra hurled, and his thunder's deadly stroke. Clouds to pieces rent and broke. Like a tree by woodsman felled a fiend by Indra quailed. Rolled the rivers fresh and new, ceaseless waters onward flew. Bursting torrents, copious fed, bore away the shapeless dead. Indra's foe, befed of breath, slept the endless sleep of death. Now this was written in the ancient antiquity by a man by the name of Ramesh Dutt, D-U-T-T. Now, I think if you stop and look at that, but there's quite a bit of other ancient evidence here that we find most remarkable, and let's quit for just a moment on this, and let's go to Greek mythology, so-called. There's a book that I have in my possession. It's called World Mythology and Anthology of the Great Myths and Epics, and it was done by Donna Rosenberg, who took the time to collect all of these ancient peoples. But before I go to that, there's another one that's a little smaller and a little more brief that I would like to refer you to here. It's a very good-sized book. It's, I think, 8.5 by 11, and it's entitled The Lore and the Lure of Outer Space. It was written around 1964, and it's, I find it a really fascinating book. It was written by a couple of folks by the name of Ernest and Johanna Hlinner. Now, what it is, actually, it shows that it has approximately 300 rare woodcuts and engravings in it. But a lot of them are referring to like the ancient constellations and so forth, and they make one note in here where they show this, they show an altar. And it says it's a figuration of Ara. A-R-A, from Hyginus Poikon Astronomicon in Venice in 1482. Now, my friends, you forgive me if I do stumble about, because some of these old words that have not been used for 500 centuries, and I do not by a long shot profess to be conversant in all of these languages. Listen, I stumble over English. But they show a picture of a woodcut of a ship here, the figuration of Argo, which is in 1482, and then they show it as part of a ship. So it's symbolic of an altar, and a blazing altar, and these flying, odd-looking dragons. And they go Argo Navis, N-A-V-I-S. The ship Argo is a huge southern constellation in the Milky Way between Canis Major and Crux, C-R-U-X, which is a cross. Its name was derived from the Greek Neos, equaling ship, and Argo, the mythical 50-oared galley of the Argonauts, in which Jason, you see, I've explained to you before. Now, this is from some other people, other than what I was quoting to you quite some number of tapes back. We showed you where in the ancient Greek, Jason was also another name meaning Jesus, or Jesus, or Yahshua. It says, which Jason and his 50 companions sought the golden fleece of Colchis, C-O-L-C-H-I-S, Colchis. According to Greek legend, the ship Argo was placed in the sky by Poseidon to be forever a guide across the southern seas. In Egyptian lore, it was identified, now get this, listen. In Egyptian lore, it was identified with the barge, say a type of ship, in which Osiris and Isis survived the flood. And biblical astronomers considered it to be Noah's Ark. The Arabians called it Al-Sufinus, from the Arabian Al-Sufina, S-U-F-I-N-A-H, the ship. In relatively recent times, it's been divided into 5 smaller constellations. And then we find from the, they speak of the mariner's compass from the Greek, P-Y-X-I-S, and box. And I needed to edit some of this and cut out so as not to bore you, the listener, as we find of recently a lot of this that we're referring to, these stars and constellations, they've been divided now or deleted into more recent times into 5 smaller constellations, but we'll skip all that. But then they refer us to the Greek, nautikos, is talking about an ark or a box, and meaning sailors, and they go into the fact that the brightest star in Argo is the brilliant first magnitude star called Canopus, the second brightest in the heaven, that was named after Canopus, the steersman, as he was referred to in those days, of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, who died in Egypt on his return voyage from Troy. Troy. You remember, my friends, as I explained to you before, that this talks about Troy and all of its battles. The Greeks here were trying to tell us of the diluvian days, which, no, my friends, were not the flood days, the great war days between the planets. And like Genesis tells us, and most of the religious world, they don't understand the Bible because they don't understand that it hinges on the understanding of Genesis 3 and 15, which, you see, there really should be no separation between the Adam and the Eve and all of this, and the Cains and the Abels and everybody getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden or being disposed from the Garden of the trees or the planets of the heavens, and the great war that ensued that Job and Revelations and John, everybody tried to tell us about, and the ancient writers of old and their long parables talking about trees and their powers, and those that were in the garden, that were in those constellations, and that were in those planets. And now later they were to become fugitives, and they were to be kicked out, and the Greeks carried it on, gave us more detail. But even with all of our computers, see, we don't do any thinking anymore. We go and, wow, man, punch the button and see what the great computer says. See what the computer comes up with. But I think that just like the boob tube, the glass toilet, that television, if it was used right, it could be one of the greatest boons to mankind that ever was, that could educate the people and bring us out of our lethargy and sleepwalking. But, my friends, we sat there and drooled in front of that nasty, degenerate stuff that most of those writers on there live on nose candy and champagne, written by a bunch of degenerates and written to match the mentality at the very best of 11-year-old. But I think that's insulting to children and the capacity that they have for learning. But once it's out of the hands in that day of these fallen hosts that still seem to be ruling from Jollywood. It can be a great instrument, but anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but what I'm saying is if we used our computers and all of the books and all of the history and the technology and the math and the brains that we do have, and if they could keep an open mind and run these ancient histories and their stories parallel, and we could find all of these common denominators, and we could match it up, and we could find all of these missing pieces to this lost puzzle that shows us the great panorama of history as to who you are, from whence you came, and why you're here, and what you're supposed to be doing, and where you're supposed to go, instead of wandering around like a zombie and a lost soul. But then there's the other people that think that they're very successful. They go on through their life seeing how much materialism that they can gather, which is left for their kids to fight over and to hate the parents because this one got more than the other one. And then they spend the rest of their life in their greedy little drive that they learn from the parents, taking it away from each other. Don't tell me this doesn't happen. I've seen it both in my family, on my wife's side of the family, and I see it among my neighbors. And they are taught by this fallen extraterrestrial that used to guard the very throne of the Almighty, and he passed it down to his people, and all of this virus of immorality and greed has spread through the boob tube and the mass media, and now is accepted as gospel in this world of usury and degeneracy and taking the edge on your neighbors. Well, all right, let's go back to this about those he spoke of dying in Egypt on his return voyage from Troy. And it goes on to say he was transformed into a star, the second brightest star in the constellation, which is Miyaplacidus, from the Aramaic M-I-Y-A-H, Maya. See, sounded like Yah, Maya, equaling supposedly waters. Now, waters, as we know, represents a great mass of people, and then we have from the Latin Placidius, undisturbed. Argo also contains what they call the Keyhole Nebula, one of the largest and brightest nebulas seen by the naked eye, a nebula surrounding a dark region in the form of a keyhole with a star, Argos, in the center. Hey, stop and think about that. What did Christ say? I stand at the door and I knock. Is that all we do? We look through the keyhole, but we don't know there's anything on the other side or somebody else residing out there. Can't anybody be living in space, even though we're standing on this dirt ball in space, and some clowns say they never get to go anywhere, where they going thousands of miles an hour here and going and passing around the sun, and they're stuck to it and don't fall off. I think that's pretty marvelous. But Argos in the center, so we say the star was named after the Greek mythological builder of the ship Argo. Now, I think that we pointed out in times past, and we went back to Solomon and his rejected, yes, I said rejected, apocryphal writings, where from the Ecclesiasticus of the Apocrypha, the writings of the preacher, what Solomon said, what was that, around the 49th chapter, he not only spoke of how it was repaired after, and a lot of people never have caught on that was the Great War, and it gave the name, the great engineer of the Almighty of outer space who rebuilt its double walls and so forth. But anyway, here we have Euriga, the charioteer from the Latin, Auriga, which also means a wagon driver, in a large northern constellation between Perseus and Gemini. In Greek lore, it represents the serpent-footed mythical first king of Athens. He was the one who invented the four-wheeled chariot because he wanted to hide his serpent feet, and because of this invention, Zeus put him into the sky as a constellation. Oh, by the way, I should mention the name of that ancient king. It was spelled in the ancient language Erectheus. As I said, he was the first mythical king of Athens. Now, for some further proof, let us continue on here. But before we go to that, here's the whole point. I think that we've missed what the ancient writers are trying to tell us about here, that the first kings of Athens, as we pointed out in our last tape, that there was so many of these kings, like the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the different ones that we named, they did not fit into the genetical line of Noah, Ham, Shem, or Japheth, and these people were of a different line, that they were fallen, extraterrestrial personages, great lords of space who had, like the Bible talks about in that day, he talks about the evil ones that are going to be cast into outer darkness. And so here's the parable that he wanted to hide his dragon feet. You remember what we said when we quoted Christ? He says, the heavens is my house, and the earth is my footstool. So in the great ships, the dragon ships, if you like, he steps down in them. And the four wheels here, is it talking about a great and mighty ship that had many great wheels accompanying it, and it got lost along the way in antiquity? Now we find, going back in the flood here, there was Lycaon that they spoke of. He was the cause. We'll go into it here. I think from the Greek, well, they actually cover it, and they have their rendition of the flood and the punishment. Now, you see, many times we assume this or we assume that. And we talk, or the Greeks speak of Zeus, the Lord of thunder and black clouds. And it talks about him returning to Mount Olympus. He was determined to punish all the mortals for their evil ways. Now, my friends, just exactly who was this Zeus? Now, a lot of them equate him to Poseidon. But I think as we get later on into this section, he talks about he alludes to the land of Noah. And he shows in the Hebrew, and we'll get into that more detail, where his claim is that Noah lived in the land of the rockets. Isn't that odd? That someone else is talking about Noah, who was possibly a great engineer. Well, how did he build that vent? Now remember, when Farrar Fenton started to re-edit the Bible, he went back, researched into the most ancient of records that were available, and he discovered that he put a fan in the ark and said that it was a ventilation fan. If you haven't got one of those, you should get it and you look it up. Now, you might want to take your concordance and go look it up from your King James perversion, as it was perverted greatly when it was put into the English, and go back and see what sort of multiple choice that you had in the Greek. Because remember, those people had no mindset of any type of science. They had never touched on it, most of these authors, and the church did not allow it. But anyway, getting back to what Sitson said, it seemed that, and he goes into great detail there, that they had these great laboratories, so to speak, and it seems like they were creating these Frankenstein-type monsters, that they were some sort of genetical hybrid that displeased, I don't know whether it was the great creator or some of these so-called gods of space, so they decided not only to destroy the laboratory, but the whole world, which I maintain what he was alluding to from the Chaldean was the planet we know today as Mars. I think at this time I should probably ask you to please turn your tape over. Point of view, and I really don't care. That doesn't matter to me from my research, whether he's for or against or prejudiced. But after listening to these pseudo-preachers and teachers out there that ignore all of this evidence that could really prove their Bible and create great followings for them, but because of their rejecting it, I believe the Almighty's rejecting them, and certainly the people are rejecting them. But I believe that this citizen, he's not some wild-eyed kook who's making all of this material up. Now, maybe in his deciphering, and maybe his explanation of it, and his understanding what he thinks it means, he may have a little different slant on it than I do, because of my background and understanding, and a lot of my beliefs, whether they're right or wrong, I interpret it to mean as such. So what I try to do is be very fair and play the devil's advocate, and I try to say, okay, here's what this old boy says. I don't care if he's the devil himself. Because every time you get to investigate something, even if it's totally wrong, and something within you says this does not compute, but then think of the fun that you have turn around and trying to find what is the truth. This is what I've had to do for the biggest part of my life, because they've played a lot of head games with me, and, well, with you on down the line, but anyway, without a whole lot of pontificating. Now, you see, we've shown you in the past that this Poseidon also was supposedly Zeus. And we have told you that at the United Nations they have represented there Zeus, which they try to represent him as Poseidon, as they put a pitchfork in his hand. But they're talking about somebody, my friends, these people, some of the major leaders, that said at that one world United Nations, which has brought nothing but evil upon this world and destruction anywhere that they supposedly tried to interfere with the affairs of a nation, and to quiet it always ended up a lot of people were butchered. But what do these people know that you don't know? And why have they alluded to Zeus as such a great hero? And why is it that your government has sent back already this year to Mars to look into it? And why is it that this month, and I will get to it a little later, that Life magazine come out with a great article? I'm trying to think of where it is, the date on it. But anyway, we'll bring that out a little later. But they show that how our scientists, they're taking it upon themselves to spend all of your hard-earned money. They're going to go back and they're going to populate Mars. They're going to reintroduce agriculture to it. And with all their science, they're going to make it a live planet again. Well, I thought that Christ said when he left that he was going back to prepare a place for you. And that I understood that he said, now in the Old Testament, think about that, that you would go back and rebuild all of the old cities. Now, while I am living in this body, I may not see this. I may not live long enough. But I believe that you will go back, as he said, and build the old waste cities. But they think they're talking about going back over there to Israel, to the Sudan, and all of these ancient places that your progenitors have been, that we're going to go back and rebuild them. No, I think he's talking about going back into rebuild worlds. And is he possibly, this the time and the hour which they're talking about using you? And there seems to be, we'll get into it a little later, there seems to be color variation upon different parts of Mars, showing that there's some sort of vegetation growing upon the planet. But let's go back and see if we can tie this up, because I've got some real good evidence, and I'm saving a lot of the best till the last. But it goes back here now in the ancient myths of Greece and Rome. We go back where they tell us that this Zeus, the Lord of thunder and black lightning, he returned back to Mount Olympus. Now you remember, my friends, in the book of Enoch, it talks about and it lists all of these fallen angels that came down on Mount Hermon. And then we hear Mount Sinai, Mount this, Mount that, Mount this. And nobody until just recently has got the connection. They're talking about great spaceships of the great Mount Olympus. What was that Mount Olympus? Was this what Job was talking about in the first chapter and the second chapter, when all of the sons of Yahweh, the Almighty, all of his children were reporting back to the mount? They were reporting back to the household, to the headquarters, what I call the United Nations of intergalactic space, and it says that the adversary was there amongst them, and the Eternal asked him, "Where have you been?" And Fenton, as I told you, had been flying over the earth and landing on the earth. And we find back in the Egyptians, they actually used the word cars. They had cars, like our air cars, that could hover just above the ground and drive over the whole surface and drive across the waters. Like that. Remember Ecclesiasticus, my friends, there is nothing new under the sun. Now the Greek mythology tells us this Zeus, he went back to Mount Olympus, and he was determined to punish all the mortals for their evil ways. Though the deathless God approved their king's decision to destroy this, what they refer to as a human race. But if they were so evil, and everybody says, well, he's human too, and they never stop to think about or analyze and say, what do you mean by human? Nobody ever thinks anymore. It's a lost art. Now, if you were to say, what does human mean? It comes from the ancient word human. It goes back to the Aryans and to the ancient book of Manu. Human, spirit man. And the book of Manu and so forth talked about those that are destitute of spirit. So does your Bible. And the book of Jude says these are those that are the destitute of spirit. They are the black clouds. Read Jude again. It reads just like this. They are the black clouds, that travel, that kept not their first estate. They left their planet, and some of these survivors of these planets and their children are still here, and they're descendants from the people of Mars. And your Bible refers to them as the Edomites. And Edom, my friend, it means red. They're the children, the descendants of the people who came from the red planet, who got kicked out, just like the Adam and the Eve and the Cain. And some of these were the descendants, the peoples of the great Khan that came or ruled over them. And so we find, although the deathless God, he approved the king's decision to destroy this race. And they were concerned about the future without mortals who would offer the sweet-smelling sacrifices to the god Zeus. And he claimed their fears when he assured them that he would create another, an even better human race once he had destroyed the present one. Or now, we cannot read the books of the Old Testament where the Almighty in Deuteronomy and so forth, he said, you're a chosen people, a special people above all the people that are on the face of the earth, and that he was a jealous God and had reserved him for himself, and he said that you were not to take of the other nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Prezerites. He said you're to make no covenants with them. You are not to take their daughters unto thy sons, nor give thy sons unto their daughters, for then somehow there would be a confusing of that great Israelite genetic gene pool. It would be distorted. It would be like taking an Irish setter and breeding them with a coonhound and German shepherds. Each one of them are lovely dogs, and they're bred for a purpose. But then, my friend, what instinct would they follow? Now, we're talking about a people here that were to be kingdom administrators and kingdom dictators. And they were the ones who was to inherit the kingdom of the Most High. And he said, I've given you the heathen as an inheritance, and to rule over them with righteousness. And if you think the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not a segregationist God, I didn't write the book. I don't care if you like it or not. You take that up with the Almighty. You go read the book of Numbers. And you see that some of the children of Israel, and that they were having a little hanky-panky. They were messing around among the trees there, with trees that were not of their trees. And we find that one of the sons of Aaron, that he got up and he started killing these people for this offense. And before the day was out, there's quite a few thousand of them killed. And so apparently here, this Zeus, if he was truly the bad guy and he was one of the gods of war, that he went and thought that his people, his household, his offspring were superior to the ancient Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he thought he could kill them off and destroy them, and he could create a better race. And maybe this is what he did do. He created some sort of hybrid race here, just like today. People are very frightened because we hear that a lot of these crazy scientists have gone awry. And they're talking about cloning, and they're talking about determining the sex of your child. And they're getting to the point that they're hinting at the fact that they're only going to breed or allow those people to reproduce that could have the high IQs. We're always talking about they're talking about the Nazis did this and the Nazis did that. Well, what are some of these wacko scientists doing today? And we stand by and we're talking about this insane word that instead of saying we're going to kill the old folks, no, we have a very pleasant, kindly word now. We call it euthanasia. And so we go and we pick out some of the most sad, disturbing cases of some of these parents whose poor child has been in a coma for 5, 6, 7 years, and then we forget that being that has a body and a soul and a spirit, and we forget the fact that a lot of them came out of their comas after years and had miracles. God is still on the throne and still able to produce miracles, but now we play God, our doctors and our government and county and state and our judges who sit on the Supreme Court. What blasphemy! And they decide who lives and who dies. A bunch of these priests of Baal in these black Halloween robes. Their robes represent the darkness of their minds and the iniquity that they're perpetrating on the people. As Scripture says, in that day they will teach you wrong is right and right is wrong. And the people today have mentally indigestion and they're totally confused. And so are we finding a repetition of today of what happened in ancient bygone days? And we were not able to recognize it because we had not done our homework or our research. So we go on, we find that Zeus, he prepared to destroy the earth with his lightning bolts. Then he realized that Mount Olympus also would ignite from such a blaze, and he put aside his weapons. Isn't this mysterious? My friends, I'm not making this up. I'm quoting from this book, World Mythologies, and they go back by this Donna Rosenberg here. It's quite an interesting book. Doesn't that sound like the Mahabharata and the Nag Hammadi? And when, as we quoted from the Mahabharata, the higher gods, they intervened and they told them of particular weapons that they were not allowed to use. They allowed them to use some pretty sophisticated equipment. But of these particular weapons that could blow a whole earth out of the universe, and later on as we get into, and you touch on some of this Greek mythology, and talks about Electra and her weeping over her lover, and she couldn't stand to see his death. And we hear about all of the dervish that goes around Saturn and some of these other planets, and many of the scientists say this is nothing more than the remnants left over of an exploded, destroyed Earth. or planet, if you like. My, aren't we thinking on a much higher level and of a great magnitude and consider these things? So he told that, well, let me repeat it. Zeus prepared to destroy this earth, or which earth was he speaking of, with his lightning bolts, when he realized that Mount Olympus also would ignite from such a blaze, and he would put aside his weapons. Instead, he decided to release the black storm clouds and to destroy the mortals by flooding the entire earth. Now, without at this point stopping and going back and quoting your chapter and verse, but the Bible in the Old Testament, it talks about from Psalm 68 when he chased kings on it, and he talks about he came down, and it talks about they rained down upon them. Rained down what? Flooded down on them. These sophisticated weapons. And then we find that Zeus here, he sent his messenger, Hermes. And he sent to his servant Alus, that was Lord of the Winds, and commanded him to imprison in his cave the winds that dry the earth and bring clear weather, but to free all of the storm winds. And out flew the dreaded south wind, shrouded in black clouds. You remember what the Chinese man said? He talked about the great dragon ships of the yin and the yang, the great black dragon ships. And now it starts to add up. And he heard, and his beard was swollen with showers and rain. What's the word beard? See, we just skipped over it lightly where we went back and we showed you that how the devil, wasn't that the tape that it was in, that said how the devil got his tail and his horns and his goatee? So it showed that when this great space station alluded to as our sister planet, that odd one that runs in reverse polarity, and you find in all of the ancient, not all of it, but quite a few places in the ancient records that tells, way back then, they knew that it turned in retrograde, the one that John said had 12 foundations, in other words, 12 floors in it. And we pointed out to you how the ancient Indians of Peru, that at one time had the great gigantic culture there, that we explained to you that these Indians would point out the fact that when the planet, the great space station, was to start to move in one direction, they called it the planet with the fiery beard. And then when it would go in another direction, it would talk about the fire would come out and they would look like horns. And we find so many places in there that talks about the man that was killed between the horns of the altar. And so the organized religious world for the last few centuries has skipped over this and ignored this and failed to understand it. Now, lest we left off here where we were speaking, it alluded in the parable form, the south wind that shrouded in black clouds, and his beard was swollen with showers, and rain poured from his wings and his clothing as he flew. So you see there, my friends, what this is talking about. How, as I told you earlier, how the clouds are made and created, and they were salted. And it says, and his hands made the heavens roar. Now, as we find even in our Bible, and David in one of the Psalms, he talks about, oh, thank you, God, that you taught my fingers to fight and my hands to make war. And we took you back to Elijah, who sent his servant over the hill to look. And he spoke out of the sea, the great sea of space. He saw a little cloud like unto a man's hand. In other words, it was the advance scout of many clouds or many warships that were to come in and to do the bidding of this Elijah, the great prophet, as he challenged the phony priests of Baal. And he alone was able to bring the fire down out of heaven. And so we go back now without arguing as to whether this was a good guy and a bad guy, and he said, and he flew, and his hands made the heavens roar, for he crushed all the moisture out of the clouds around him, causing heavy rains to fall upon land and sea. And so as to kind of paraphrase a whole lot of it here, they tell about a lot of people that were drowned. Then it talked about all of the chaos here. It caused a big part of the remaining people to starve to death. Now we're going to find out that even though this sounds very odd and strange, as we get into the Chaldean account, which the ancient Hebrews also spoke, and they give a much different account of the flood. But I believe it was talking about a great disastrous thing that brought shall we say, a second and final wave of refugees from the area known as Mars. And it could also include some of these other planets. I'm not arguing that point at all, but I'm not saying that I, at this point, have it pinned down. At this point, I've gone back, tried to edit some out as to make it move along quickly and not be boring, but there's a couple other characters, Deucalion and Pyria. It speaks of their rebirth in the Greek mythology here, and it talks about the creative. Now, you remember what we said, that referring back, I'm just paraphrasing, that Sitchin and some of these people seem to refer to some ancient writings that I wasn't quite that familiar with, that referred to that there was some Frankenstein-type experiments going on with different species and creating subspecies of men. However they did it. But let's go back to the Greeks. If this sounds far-fetched, now you see here, my friends, I'm going to point out that Christendom and their little story about, and God created Adam out of the dust of the earth, my friends, is due to the misunderstanding that this Semitic Adam man was brought here to this terra firma, this terrestrial plane. He was not made here out of dirt. All right, granted, he has some of the same, most all the same elements in his body that you can also find in the ground. Iron and zinc and potassium, and all right, so his leather jacket is covered with that, but he was not made here. He was an eternal being, like the Almighty was in Romans 8th chapter. He who I foreknew, I did pre-pick. Who I did pre-pick, I did predestinate. And he said he sanctified you, justified you, glorified you. If he be for you, who can be against you? And as I pointed out in Proverbs 8th chapter, the Almighty is trying to tell the Semitic man and even the pre-Adamic peoples that you were there beside me when I created even the dust of the earth. Now, so we're going back to the great creative titans of those days who, this has been incorporated into Christian theology about creating men. This science and this history has been lost. So we go back here to Deucalion and Pyria and what is titled a rebirth, the creative titan Prometheus had fashioned, that says, the first mortal beings, the race that Zeus was now destroying out of earth and water. All right, which earth? Which planet? Because Prometheus had helped his humans by stealing fire from the forge of I better spell it for you just in case you want to look it up. Hephaestus. Now, this great ancient mythical man, this Hephaestus, he was supposed to be the immortal blacksmith that Zeus had punished him by ordering him to nail him to Mount, Caucasus in Scythia. That was the area to the north and southeast, they've assumed, of the Black Sea. But you see, so many of these people have brought it down. They don't understand that this was alluding to a temple in outer space. There's a great deal that we could get into, but there's some other areas that I have to cover here. But in this same chapter, as it goes on, it tells about the temple. Themis was slimy with moss and mud, and the fire that had once continuously burned upon the altar blazed no more. Now, where are they talking about? And you find so many times, even in our Bible, where they're talking about an altar, it's not a religious thing, but it's talking from whence they launched rockets. Yes, in those great days of antiquity, we remind you again, we're going to get into it. We're going to run out of time in this tape here. We find that the coupleless God lay down on the floor and they kissed the cold stones and they prayed, if the deathless gods are able to put aside their great anger, may they listen and grant our wish. You see, they're talking about other people in outer space who had not come under the sin or the fall of Adam and who had not lost their first estate. Now he said if they could only put aside their great anger and listen to our wish, great Themis, and tell us how to renew our race. They have drowned, and we who remain are in despair. To these words, the compassionate goddess, replied, when you leave my temple. Now remember, the goddess, either this was the heathen who had distorted it, but was it talking about, as we proved before, where we talk about Adam and Eve come from the word kava or kave, which meant a life container, which we equated also to what Job said when he came forth from the bosom of the Father and the very womb of the morning. Now, wasn't that odd, you see? It goes on to these words, compassionate goddess replied, when you leave my temple. Was this talking about a house in outer space? Was this talking about Venus? And was this a corruption by the Greeks to where it's lost? But it goes on to say, loosen your clothing so that it flows freely around you, then hide your face and throw the bones of your great-grandmother behind you. Now see, this is some more of the ancient idioms and etymology that we've lost the understanding. It says, after a long silence, Pyrrha and Deucalion, I may not obey the great goddess. I tremble as I beg her pardon, but my mother's shade would wander homeless if I disturb her bones. Surely, however, the great goddess was well aware of this problem, so Deucalion and Pyrrha slowly repeated the strange set of directions, hoping to find another meaning buried in these words. Finally, Deucalion said, the deathless gods are just. They would not command us to do something evil, unless I misunderstand the oracle. The earth is our great mother, and her bones are the stones and rocks about us. Now, was this possibly referring once again back to Venus, which we have maintained and proved is an artificial planet? It was created by a great scientific intelligence. It's so great and so fantastic that most of us are like primitive cavemen, and we can't cope with the idea of something that's been up there thousands of years and that is artificial. And so was he talking about the bones, the steel structures, talking about the mother, which in reality was not a flesh and blood mother, but it was something referring to the fact to remind them from whence they came and why they were here. I want to take this time and go back quite a number of years ago. In fact, I'm embarrassed this time. I don't remember. I think this book was written way back in the 60s from the Home of the Gods by a man by the name of Andrew Thomas. And he started out by speaking of by ark and aircraft. And then he goes in, just like that we have in the mythology and the ancient writings, that he believes showed the last days of Atlantis was a virtual doomsday. And then he goes back and he apparently done some real great research, but he talked about the mountain-like ocean waves and the hurricanes, and he describes in great detail volcanic explosions which swept over the planet, and civilization came to a virtual standstill, and remaining mankind, he goes on to say, was reduced to a barbaric state. And then for evidence, he takes us back to the Sumerian tablets that you've heard me speak of in times past, of Gilgamesh. And when he speaks, now keep this word, U-T, it starts out N-A-P-I-S-H-T-I-M, Ut-Nap-Ish-Tim. Now we hear of men also, U2. Was it taken from this, or men from this area? And it speaks of primeval ancestors of humanities whose family were supposed to have been the only survivors of this flood. And he saved his peoples and animals and birds in an ark. The biblical account, he claims, of Noah appears to be a very much a later version of the same story. Now, I think because I'm getting a little paranoid here that we're running short on time in this tape, and especially since I named it about the face of Cain, and I claim that that is the face of Cain, the great Khan, the offspring or the father of Cain, who is the progenitor of all evil. Because we go back, and what in further tapes, I'm always running out of time, and it's a great effort for me to try to talk fast. Now, a lot of people write to me and say that I talk too fast, and other times it's just right, and it's pretty hard to please everybody. But you see, we're going to go back in case I don't get to it in time. They talk about in Atlantis, but you see, here's the man, I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, he had the proof, but not realizing this was the face on Mars that was later discovered in 1976. And there's been several men have written on this. But this ancient commentary to the book is quite clear about the manner in which the Exodus was carried out in Atlantis, the great king of the dazzling face, the leader of the enlightened in Atlantis. And as many of you have known, I have claimed for a long time the lost civilizations of Lemura and of Atlantis and Mu and the people of Mu. They came here to Indra, as it was named India later on, that these were the Aryans, these were the refugees left over from a great problem in the Diluvian era, as we call it. But anyway, they speak of seeing the inevitability of a great catastrophe, sent his airships to his brother chiefs in Atlanta, and he, with the message, prepare, raise ye men of the good law, and cross that land while dry. Now, my friends, you remember, you go back, see, he's talking about there's many others. If you really do a little bit of research, that say that flood of Genesis it's mystified a lot of people who go beyond these people who are out there looking on some mountaintop for an ark, and then the next breath telling me it covered the whole earth. But then there are those that are still terribly confused between what many of them say is nothing more than a Babylonian account that the Hebrews brought these Jewish fables, or Yehudim, those who came out of Babylon. It doesn't particularly mean any race or religion, but it was unfortunately translated by the Greeks, Jewish fables. They brought these out of Babylon, and so there can be some doubt as to the accuracy, and that the books have been tampered with, or at least we know for a fact the English. And then what about this Chaldean account that has been rejected by the church world for 125 years? But notice he says, prepare, raise your men of the good law, and cross the land while it's dry. And why was Noah saved? I got to repeat again. It said by grace he was saved. Grace from the Almighty. Why? Because Noah was a righteous man. He was a law keeper. All right, now he hadn't had the opportunity to accept salvation, accept the Lord into his heart and get saved and avoid all that. The law has never saved anybody from anything, but it sure counted for a whole lot with the Almighty in the days of Noah, because he said, I hear the prayers of those who keep my commandments, and he was pure in his generations. I'm sorry, friend, it's a racist book. If you don't like it, throw it away. But it said he was pure in his generation. You look it up, it means race. He did not mix with those fallen Nephilim. Now, as I have spoke with some of you before about the Sumerian tablets of Gilgamesh, and who was one of the primeval survivors of humanity and his family, were supposed to have been the only survivors, and it tells a story about just like the biblical account of Noah and going into ark and saving all of the animals and so forth. Then we go into what is called the Zenda Avesta, Zendavesta of Iran. We find another rendering of the flood legend. Yima, Y-I-M-A, a Persian patriarch, and you remember, my friends, that the people who inhabited ancient Persia were migratory people of the same Aryan stock that moved through and lived in that land for a long time, later to give it up to other people who come in long after the Aryan Semitic type man was to leave. But we go to Yima. He was a Persian patriarch who was ordered by the god Ahura Mazda, or Azada, Ahuramazda, to prepare for a world deluge. Accordingly to Yima, Y-I-M-A, he constructed a cavern, which animals and plant things useful to men were to be enclosed during the inundation. This is how civilization was revived after the destruction brought about by the Great Flood. Now, you remember we pointed out and proved what a cave was, just like where it spoke of Noah, and it spoke of Elijah when the Almighty hid him in the palm of his hand and hid him in the cleft of the rock. We're talking about a rocket ship, an enclosure, and you can see through the translation and so forth and the darkness of men's minds how this has been lost. Now, you heard me talk about the Mahabharata of India and how it related to Brahma taking the shape of a fish and so forth. And he warned Manu, the father of the human race, of the approaching flood. Now Manu was instructed to build a ship to take in the 7 great sages of all the different seeds enumerated by the Brahmas of yore and preserve them carefully. And Manu, he followed the orders of Brahman. The vessel carried him and the 7 wise men and the seed and all of these things and peoples and creatures that were to perpetuate the rehabilitation of mankind and those survivors that traveled for years on the heaped up waters until they landed in the Himalayas. And the traditional lore of India points to Manali, M-A-N-A-L-I, and what they call the Kulu Valley in the town of Manu as the possible spot where Manu disembarked. The district is generally known as Avarta, now to the land of the Aryans. And this is how the Manali of the Himalayas, that is their chapter, is written. But you have to remember, my friends, as we learned also in the Hebrew and the Christian Bible, that this was merely men that brought the history from the other planets here and started to name places on this earth after them. This is how they got lost. So we find that the resemblance of the rescue of Noah to that of Manu does not seem to be just coincidental. It's a notable fact that all of these records of these great floods and so-called certain chosen people are attributed with a foreknowledge of this approaching either world or localized calamity that was to come upon them. And we find the escape from the doomed land of what men has erroneously thought was Atlantis, which I think was geographical areas, or also an ancient referral to the planet of Mars. Now, it seems that there's the escape from that doomed land of so-called Atlantis was affected in aircraft as well as sea vessels. There are numerous historical traditions that go back to the seemingly fantastic stories. We find the Eskimos, they have a curious legend, has been transported to the frozen north by, they were taken there by these great metallic birds. And then we find the Western Indian, he calls them thunderbirds. So doesn't this suggest the presence of airship and the prehistory or pre-recording of the history of mankind? And anybody with a little research and background, a little common sense, you look at those Eskimos, you're looking at the Mongolians of the steppes of Russia, upper, lower, inner, and outer Mongolia. You're looking at people who have other people look exactly like them in all areas of China, and then when they go with this absurd story that the white man discovering the Americas and so forth, well, the Chinese discovered it thousands of years beforehand, and I've been down in some of the most unexplored regions of the Amazons, what is called to those people down there as the Amazones. And I've gone up and I've talked with people that were short and bandy-legged and squatty and had flat nose and slant eyes, dark complected and pitch black hair, and varying in all different sizes and degrees, because within the Oriental, what we call the Oriental race, I believe that there's species and subspecies and different races within this one that's just classified as an Oriental race, unfortunately. So they, like the Western man, they have been cheated out of their inheritance. Now we find the Aborigines of the Northern Territory in Australia. They also have a tale of this great flood and the Birdmen and the Karan, K-A-R-A-N, a chief who gave wings to Warark, W-A-A-R-K, and Weirk, W-E-I-R-K, when the waters filled up the creek and the sea came up and covered all the country, the hills and the trees and everything. Then Karan himself flew away and sat down alongside, now get this, the moon. And it speaks of the bird people watched him. So you see, I tell you what, those so-called primitive aborigines that I don't believe you can classify or compare them to any other race upon this earth. They have a distinct racial type of their own. I remember nearly 30 years ago I started to research into the ancient and most primitive races, and here was some, forgive my French, dumb, asinine, intellectual yo-yos from some of these universities of higher learning, put them down as Caucasians. Well, all white men are not Caucasians because they didn't all migrate through the Caucasus Mountains. Well, my friends, I'm terribly sorry. Just as we're getting wrapped up here and really rolling, we're going to have to sign off. So write to me, Noah Fredericks, Pilgrim Ships, P.O. Box 1086, Lakeview, Missouri, 7